The lone figure stood out against the harsh Montana landscape, a silhouette of mourning that had become as much a part of the town of Silverhorn as the mountains themselves. Beatrice Morrow had worn black for so long that the townspeople couldn't remember her in any other color, her grief as enduring as the vast prairie that surrounded their small settlement in 1878. The dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber, and rose as Beatrice awoke to the familiar silence of her small homestead. 10 years had passed since she'd buried her husband, 10 years since she'd spoken more than necessary to anyone in town, 10 years since she'd allowed herself to feel anything but the dull ache of loss. She moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, lighting the stove, brewing coffee, and preparing a simple breakfast. Her home was modest but well kept, the floors swept clean, the furniture dusted, and everything in its proper place. Order was her refuge in a world that had proven itself to be chaotic and cruel. As she finished her coffee, a sound at the front door caught her attention. It wasn't a knock. She rarely received visitors these days, but rather a soft rustling. Curious, she approached the door with caution, her hand hesitating on the latch before pulling it open. There, on her doorstep, lay a small bouquet of wildflowers, lupines, and Indian paintbrush tied with a simple piece of twine. Beatrice stared at them, uncomprehending. She looked up, scanning the surrounding area, but saw no one. The rolling grasslands and scattered trees offered no clue as to who might have left such a gift. With trembling fingers, she picked up the flowers. It had been so long since anyone had given her anything. So long since she'd held something so vibrant and alive. The scent of them brought back memories she tried to bury, of picnics by the creek, of laughter, of love. She brought them inside, searching through her cupboards until she found a small glass jar to serve as a vase. As she arranged the flowers on her kitchen table, she wondered who could have left them. Perhaps it was Mrs. Peterson's young daughter, or one of the children from town playing some kind of game. The next morning, she woke with the strange sensation of anticipation. She tried to dismiss it as she went about her chores, but found herself pausing every few minutes to listen for sounds outside her door. Just as the sun crested the horizon, she heard it again, that same soft rustling. This time, she moved quickly to the door, pulling it open with more haste than she'd shown in years. But again, she saw only the empty porch and a fresh bouquet of wildflowers. Different from yesterday's, these were wild roses and daisies, their petals still wet with dew. For 7 days, the ritual continued. Each morning, just as dawn broke, a new bouquet would appear on her doorstep. Each morning, Beatrice would try to catch a glimpse of her mysterious benefactor, and each morning she would fail. On the 8th day, determined to solve the mystery, she rose well before dawn and positioned herself by the window, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. She waited, watching as the stars slowly faded and the first hint of light appeared in the eastern sky. Movement caught her eye, a tall figure approaching on horseback from the direction of the foothills. The rider dismounted some distance from her home, leading his horse quietly. In the growing light, she could make out the shape of a man, his movements careful and deliberate as he approached her door. From a saddlebag, he withdrew a small bunch of flowers. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a child from town or a well-meaning neighbor. It was a stranger, a man she'd never seen before. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy: denim trousers, a faded shirt, boots worn from miles in the saddle, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face in the early morning light. He placed the flowers gently on her doorstep, arranging them with unexpected care. Then, after a moment's hesitation, He touched the brim of his hat as if paying respects and turned to leave. Without thinking, Beatrice moved to the door and pulled it open. "Wait," she called, her voice hoarse from disuse. The man froze, then slowly turned back toward her. In the growing light, she could see his face now weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. His eyes, a startling clear blue, widened in surprise. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat again. "Why?" It was all she could think to ask, gesturing to the flowers at her feet. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable at being caught. He began, then cleared his throat. "I've been passing through on my way to the north pastures. Saw you. Well, saw your place here. Thought maybe some flowers might brighten your day." His voice was deep but gentle, with the hint of a southern drawl. "You've been leaving them every day for a week," Beatrice said, not as an accusation but as a simple statement of fact. He nodded. "Yes, madam." "What's your name?" "Owen. Owen Abernathy. I'm working at the Rocking Tea Ranch just over the ridge." "I'm Beatrice Morrow," she replied, surprising herself with the introduction. It had been so long since she'd offered her name to anyone new. "Mrs. Morrow," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I can stop with the flowers if they're unwelcome." Beatrice looked down at the fresh bouquet of wild daisies and columbine. "No," she said softly, "they're not unwelcome." A small smile touched his lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Then I'm glad to hear it." He glanced at the lightening sky. "I should be getting on. Mr. Tucker doesn't take kindly to tardiness." "Of course," Beatrice said, suddenly feeling self-conscious in her simple nightdress and shawl. "Thank you for the flowers." Owen nodded, touched his hat once more, and turned to his horse. Beatrice watched as he mounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle, then rode away toward the eastern hills where the Rocking Tea spread its vast cattle operation. As she bent to pick up the flowers, Beatrice realized her heart was beating faster than it had in years. The feeling was so foreign that it took her a moment to recognize it, a mixture of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite name. She carried the flowers inside, adding them to the collection that now brightened her small home. For the first time in a decade, something had changed in her carefully ordered existence. A small crack had appeared in the wall she'd built around herself. The next morning, Beatrice rose earlier than usual. She dressed with more care than she'd shown in years, choosing her customary black dress, but taking time to brush her hair thoroughly, noticing with a start that among the dark strands, threads of silver now gleamed. She was only 32, but grief had aged her beyond her years. As dawn approached, she positioned herself by the window again, waiting. Sure enough, just as the sky began to lighten, she saw the now familiar figure approaching on horseback. This time, she didn't wait for him to leave the flowers and go. Instead, she opened the door as he dismounted. Owen looked up, startled, the bunch of Indian paintbrush and bluebells in his hand. "Mrs. Morrow," he said, removing his hat. "Good morning." "Mr. Abernathy," she replied with a slight nod. "I thought perhaps you might like some coffee. It's brewing now." Surprise flickered across his face, followed by a warm smile that transformed his features. "That's mighty kind of you, madam. I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition. It seems the least I can do after all these flowers." She gestured to the bouquet in his hand. "Well, in that case, I'd be honored." He secured his horse to the hitching post near her small barn, then followed her inside, ducking slightly to enter through the doorway. Beatrice's home was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a table with 4 chairs, and 2 doors leading to what Owen presumed were a bedroom and perhaps a pantry or storage room. Everything was meticulously clean and organized, but there was a starkness to it, an absence of personal touches that made it feel more like a place of refuge than a home. "Please, sit," Beatrice said, gesturing to the table as she moved to the stove where the coffee pot steamed. Owen placed the flowers on the table, then removed his hat and sat, looking somewhat out of place on the small wooden chair, his large frame making the furniture seem diminutive in comparison. "You've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes taking in the details of her home. "Thank you. It's sufficient for my needs." Beatrice poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table, then, after a moment's hesitation, retrieved a small jar of honey and a pitcher of cream. "I don't know how you take your coffee," she said, placing them before him. "Black is fine, madam, but thank you." He wrapped his hands around the cup, and she noticed they were large and callous, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living. An awkward silence fell between them, 2 strangers who had somehow established a peculiar ritual without ever having spoken until yesterday. "May I ask," Beatrice finally said, "why you chose to leave flowers at my door? The truth, please." Owen took a sip of his coffee, seemingly gathering his thoughts. "The truth," he repeated, meeting her gaze directly. "I've been working at the Rocking Tea for about 2 months now. My route to the North Pastures takes me past your homestead. I noticed you early on, always dressed in black, always alone." He paused. "There was something about the way you carried yourself, a dignity but also a sorrow that seemed familiar." He looked down at his coffee. "I lost my wife and young son to typhoid fever 3 years ago back in Texas. I know something about grief, Mrs. Morrow, about how it can hollow you out until you're just going through the motions of living." Beatrice felt her throat tighten at his words, at the raw honesty in them. "I don't know what you lost," Owen continued, "but I recognized the look of someone carrying a heavy burden. The flowers. It was just a small thing, a way of saying you're not invisible, that someone sees you." Beatrice blinked rapidly, fighting back unexpected tears. "My husband," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas, 10 years ago. He was trying to stop a bank robbery in town. He wasn't even the sheriff, just a bystander who couldn't stand by and do nothing." "I'm sorry," Owen said simply. "We'd been married 5 years. We were going to start a family." The words came out before she could stop them, secrets she'd kept locked away spilling forth to this stranger who somehow didn't feel like a stranger anymore. "It's a hard thing, to have the future you planned suddenly vanish," Owen said, understanding in his eyes. Beatrice nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. For a long moment they sat in silence, but it was no longer awkward, rather. It held the weight of shared understanding, of grief recognized and acknowledged. Finally, Owen glanced at the growing light outside the window. "I should be on my way. Mr. Tucker will be expecting me." "Of course," Beatrice said, regaining her composure. "Thank you for the flowers. They're beautiful." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Morrow. It was the best I've had in a long while." At the door, he paused. "Would it be presumptuous of me to continue bringing flowers?" A small smile touched Beatrice's lips, the first in what felt like forever. "No, Mr. Abernathy, it wouldn't be presumptuous at all." The ritual continued, but with a difference. Each morning, Owen would arrive with fresh wildflowers, and Beatrice would invite him in for coffee. Their conversations were brief, constrained by his need to get to work, but each day they shared a little more of themselves. She learned that he had grown up on a small ranch in Texas, the son of a Confederate soldier who'd returned from the war a changed man. Owen had married young to his childhood sweetheart, Sarah, and they'd had a son they named James. After losing them both, he drifted westward, taking work where he could find it, never staying in one place too long. "Until now," Beatrice asked one morning, 2 weeks after their first conversation. Owen considered this, stirring honey into his coffee, a habit he'd developed despite his initial preference for it black. Perhaps, he said thoughtfully, Silverhorn has a certain appeal to it. In turn, Beatrice shared pieces of her own story. How she'd come west with her parents as a child. How her father had built this very house with his own hands. How both her parents had succumbed to influenza within months of each other, leaving her the homestead. How she'd met Thomas Morrow when he'd come to repair her roof after a storm. How they'd fallen in love quickly and deeply. How they dreamed of filling the house with children. Each morning's conversation was like adding a small stone to a cairn, gradually building something between them, not yet friendship, but something more than mere acquaintance. The town of Silverhorn noticed the change. It was subtle at first, the mysterious appearance of colorful wildflowers in Beatrice's home when she came to town for supplies. The fact that she now acknowledged greetings with more than a curt nod. The way she sometimes lingered to exchange pleasantries with Mrs. Peterson at the general store or Dr. Wallace at the post office. Then there was the stranger, the tall cowboy from the rocking tea, who seemed to have taken an interest in the widow Morrow. People noticed him stopping by her place in the early mornings, the way he tipped his hat to her when their paths crossed in town on Saturdays. Gossip, inevitable in a small town like Silverhorn, began to circulate. Some found it romantic, the lonely widow and the mysterious cowboy. Others were more cynical, suggesting he had designs on her property or that she was desperate for male attention after so many years alone. Beatrice, who had once been impervious to town gossip, found herself bothered by the whispers and sidelong glances. One Saturday in late August, as she selected fabric at Harmon's Dry Goods, she overheard two women speaking in low voices. "They say he visits her every morning," one said. "A man doesn't call on a woman that regularly unless he's getting something in return." "Hush, Mabel," the other replied. "Beatrice Morrow has always been respectable. Besides, the poor woman's been alone for 10 years. Would it be so terrible if she found some comfort?" "All I'm saying is, it's not proper. If his intentions are honorable, he should court her properly, not sneak around at dawn like a thief." Beatrice's hands trembled as she set down the bolt of calico she'd been examining. Without a word, she left the store, ignoring Mrs. Harmon's concerned inquiry about whether she'd found what she needed. The next morning, when Owen arrived with his customary bouquet black-eyed Susans and prairie smoke, Beatrice met him at the door with a troubled expression. "Mrs. Morrow," he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Is everything all right?" "People are talking, Mr. Abernathy," she said without preamble, "about your visits here." Owen's expression sobered. "I see, and that bothers you. I've been the subject of gossip before. When Thomas died, there were those who thought I was too young to live alone, that I should remarry quickly or move back east to relatives. I ignored them then." She hesitated. "But this is different. Because of me," Owen said, understanding in his eyes. "Because of how it looks. A man visiting a widow alone, especially at such an early hour." Owen was quiet for a moment, considering. "Would you prefer I stop coming?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Beatrice realized with a start that the thought of no longer seeing him each morning, of no longer sharing those quiet conversations over coffee, left an ache in her chest. "No," she admitted softly. "But perhaps we could find a more conventional way to continue our acquaintance." A slow smile spread across Owen's face. "Mrs. Morrow, are you suggesting I court you properly?" Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm suggesting that if you wish to continue our friendship, it might be best to do so in a way that doesn't invite speculation." "Well then," Owen said, his eyes warm with something that made Beatrice's heart beat faster. Would you do me the honor of accompanying me to the Harvest Festival next Saturday? As my guest, formally invited in the light of day. The Harvest Festival was Silverhorn's biggest social event of the year, a celebration of the summer's bounty before the harsh winter set in. Everyone in town and from the surrounding homesteads would be there. To attend with Owen would be a clear statement and acknowledgement that they were, at the very least, keeping company. Yes, Beatrice said, surprising herself with how easily the acceptance came. I would like that. Owen's smile widened. I'll call for you at noon then. He handed her the bouquet, their fingers brushing briefly. Until tomorrow, Mrs. Morrow. Until tomorrow, Mr. Abernathy. As he rode away, Beatrice stood in her doorway longer than usual, watching until he disappeared over the ridge. Only then did she realize she was smiling a real smile that reached her eyes and warmed her from within. The morning visits continued, but now there was a new current running beneath their conversations, a sense of anticipation, of possibility. Each day, as they talked over coffee, Beatrice found herself noticing new things about Owen, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the way his hands cradled the coffee cup as if it were something precious, how he always listened with complete attention when she spoke. For the first time in 10 years, Beatrice allowed herself to think beyond the boundaries of her grief. As the day of the Harvest Festival approached, she found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. She had nothing to wear but her black dresses, her mourning clothes that had become like a second skin. After a day of indecision, she rode into town to visit Harmon's dry goods once more. Mrs. Harmon, a kind woman in her 50s with a keen eye for both fabric and gossip, seemed genuinely pleased to see her. Mrs. Morrow, how lovely to see you again. I was worried when you left so suddenly the other day. I apologize for that, Mrs. Harmon. I wasn't feeling well. Mrs. Harmon nodded, though her eyes suggested she might have guessed the real reason. What can I help you with today? Beatrice hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. I need fabric for a new dress. Something that isn't black. Mrs. Harmon's face softened with understanding. Well now, that's wonderful news. Let me show you what we have. They spent the next hour selecting a beautiful navy blue cotton with a subtle floral pattern, along with matching thread, buttons, and trim. As Mrs. Harmon measured and cut the fabric, she chatted amiably about the upcoming festival. It's going to be quite the affair this year. The Tuckers have donated a steer for the barbecue, and Mrs. Peterson is organizing games for the children. There's even talk of a dance in the evening. She glanced at Beatrice. Will you be attending? It would be lovely to see you there. Yes, Beatrice said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. Mr. Abernathy has asked to escort me. Mrs. Harmon's hand stilled momentarily before she continued cutting. Has he now? Well, that's wonderful. He seems like a fine man from what I've seen of him. You know him? Beatrice asked, surprised. Not well, but he comes in occasionally for supplies. Always polite, pays his bills promptly. Mr. Harmon says he's one of the best hands the Rocking Tea has hired in years. She finished cutting the fabric and began to fold it. And he has good taste in women, clearly. Beatrice felt herself blush, unaccustomed to such personal remarks. We're merely friends, Mrs. Harmon. Of course, the older woman said with a knowing smile. Friends are where all the best things start, don't you think? The day before the festival, Beatrice worked feverishly to finish her new dress. She hadn't sewn anything so elaborate in years, and her fingers were stiff and clumsy at first. But as she worked, the old skills came back to her, and by evening the dress was complete. She tried it on, standing before the small mirror in her bedroom. The navy blue made her pale skin look less wan, and the cut of the dress reminded her that, beneath the shapeless black garments, She still had a woman's figure. She'd swept her dark hair up, revealing a neck that was still slender and elegant despite the passage of years. For a moment, she hardly recognized herself. The woman in the mirror looked like someone from another life, someone who might laugh, who might dance, who might even, someday, love again. The thought brought a surge of guilt so strong it nearly made her tear the dress off. Was she betraying Thomas by wanting to live again? By finding joy in another man's company? She sat heavily on the edge of her bed, the beautiful fabric pooling around her. In the stillness of her room, she could almost hear Thomas's voice, practical, kind, always with that hint of humor. 10 years is a long time to wear black, B, he might have said. Too long to be alone. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were different from the tears she'd shed over the years, not the sharp, wrenching sobs of fresh grief, nor the hollow, empty weeping of despair. These were gentle tears, cleansing somehow, like rain that nourishes rather than floods. By the time Owen arrived the next day, Beatrice had made her peace with her decision. She wore the blue dress, her hair arranged simply but carefully, and a small cameo brooch that had been her mother's, her only piece of jewelry besides her wedding ring, which now hung on a chain beneath her dress, close to her heart but no longer binding her hand. Owen's reaction when she opened the door was everything she could have hoped for. His eyes widened, taking in the transformation, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. "Mrs. Morrow," he finally said, "you look absolutely beautiful." Beatrice felt herself blush, unused to compliments after so many years. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. You look quite handsome yourself." It was true. Owen had clearly made an effort for the occasion. His usual work clothes had been replaced by clean denims, a pressed white shirt, a vest, and a newer-looking hat. His face was freshly shaved, and his hair, usually hidden beneath his hat, was revealed to be a rich brown with hints of gold where the sun had lightened it. "Shall we?" he asked, offering his arm. Beatrice hesitated only a moment before placing her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the fabric of his shirt. "Yes, let's." Owen had brought his wagon rather than his horse, a practical choice for the occasion. He helped her up onto the seat with careful hands, then climbed up beside her. As they set off toward town, Beatrice was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the clean scent of soap, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed against hers with the movement of the wagon, the deep timbre of his voice as he pointed out a hawk circling above the prairie. The harvest festival was held in the large meadow at the edge of town, where tables had been set up beneath colorful bunting, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. Children ran laughing between the stalls where local craftspeople displayed their wares, and musicians were setting up on a small platform for later entertainment. As Owen helped Beatrice down from the wagon, she felt the weight of many eyes upon them. Their arrival together was causing exactly the stir she had anticipated. For a moment, she considered fleeing back to the safety of her homestead, back to the predictable solitude she'd known for so long. Then Owen leaned down slightly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "We don't have to stay if you're uncomfortable. We could take a drive instead, have a picnic by the creek." His offer, so considerate of her feelings, steadied her. "No," she said, finding her resolve. "I want to be here, with you." The smile he gave her was worth all the curious stares and whispered comments. "Then, that's what we'll do." They made their way through the festival, stopping to admire quilts and woodwork, sampling Mrs. Peterson's famous apple pie and watching the children's sack races. Gradually, Beatrice began to relax, bolstered by Owen's steady presence and by the many genuine welcomes she received. Dr. Wallace, the town physician who had attended Thomas in his final hours, clasped her hand warmly. "It does my heart good to see you here, Mrs. Morrow, and in such fine company." Sheriff Daniels, who had been deputy when Thomas was killed, tipped his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Morrow, Mr. Abernathy, fine day for a festival." Even Mrs. Harmon beamed approvingly when she saw Beatrice in the dress they had chosen together. "You look lovely, my dear. The color suits you perfectly." As the afternoon progressed into evening, lanterns were lit around the meadow, casting a warm glow over the festivities. The musicians began to play in earnest fiddles, a guitar, and a harmonica, creating lively tunes that soon had couples forming for dancing. Owen turned to Beatrice, a question in his eyes. "Would you care to dance, Mrs. Morrow?" Beatrice hesitated. She hadn't danced since before Thomas died. The thought of being held in a man's arms, of moving to music, seemed both terrifying and exhilarating. "I'm afraid I'm out of practice," she admitted. "That makes two of us," Owen said with a gentle smile. "Perhaps we can remind each other of the steps." Before she could overthink it, Beatrice nodded. "I'd like that." Owen led her to the edge of the makeshift dance floor, where couples were already twirling to a spirited reel. He took her right hand in his left, placed his other hand lightly at her waist, and with a nod to the rhythm, began to guide her into the dance. At first, Beatrice was stiff, too conscious of her body, of Owen's touch, of the eyes watching them. But as they moved, the music seemed to seep into her bones, reminding her muscles of movements long forgotten. Owen was a good partner, confident enough to lead but responsive to her cues, his hand at her waist providing gentle guidance without constraint. By the second dance, Beatrice found herself smiling, caught up in the simple joy of movement and music. By the third, she was laughing as Owen spun her in a circle, her skirt flaring out around her legs. "You're a natural, Mrs. Morrow," Owen said as they paused for breath, his eyes warm with admiration. "Beatrice," she said impulsively. "Please call me Beatrice." His smile deepened. "Beatrice," he repeated, as if savoring the taste of her name. "And I'm Owen." "Owen," she echoed, feeling as if some invisible barrier between them had dissolved with the simple exchange of names. As the evening wore on, they danced again and again, stopping only for refreshments or to rest briefly on one of the benches at the edge of the meadow. In those quiet moments, they talked about the festival, about the town, about the changing seasons and the beauty of the Montana landscape. It was during one such interlude that Owen, looking out at the star-filled sky above them, spoke in a more serious tone. "I want you to know something, Beatrice. These past weeks, getting to know you, they've meant a great deal to me." Beatrice felt her heart quicken. "They've meant a great deal to me as well. When I lost Sarah and James, I thought that part of my life was over, that I'd just drift from place to place, doing enough to get by but never really living again." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "But then I saw you, standing in your garden one morning, and something woke up inside me." Beatrice found she couldn't look away from his gaze, couldn't pretend not to understand what he was saying. "I know," she said softly. "I felt it too, that first morning you left flowers. It was like coming back to life after being half asleep for years." Owen reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused against her skin. "I don't want to rush you, Beatrice. I know you've carried your grief for a long time, and I respect that. But I'd like to keep seeing you if you'll allow it. Not just in the early mornings or at town events, but properly. I'd like to court you if you're willing." The word court hung in the air between them, so old-fashioned and yet so full of promise. Beatrice looked down at their joined hands, feeling the steady strength in Owen's grip, the gentleness with which he held her. "Yes," she said, raising her eyes to meet his once more. "I'd like that very much." The smile that lit Owen's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, radiant with hope and joy. For a moment, Beatrice thought he might kiss her, but instead, he simply squeezed her hand and stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "In that case, may I have the honor of escorting you home, Miss Beatrice?" he asked, a playful formality in his tone. "You may indeed, Mr. Owen," she replied, matching his tone with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. As they walked back to his wagon, Beatrice was aware of the curious glances from townspeople, but they no longer bothered her. Let them talk. Let them whisper about the widow Morrow and her cowboy. For the first time in a decade, she felt truly alive, and no amount of gossip could diminish that feeling. The ride back to her homestead was peaceful, the night air cool but not cold, the stars brilliant overhead. They spoke little, comfortable in the silence that had developed between them over weeks of early morning conversations. When they reached her home, Owen helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you for today," he said, his voice low in the darkness. "It was the finest day I've had in a very long time." "Thank you," Beatrice replied, "for the flowers, for the dances, for seeing me when I'd become invisible, even to myself." In the silver moonlight, Owen's face was half in shadow, but his eyes were bright as they held hers. Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he leaned down. Beatrice felt her breath catch, but she didn't move, didn't look away. His lips touched hers with exquisite gentleness, a question more than a demand. After a heartbeat's hesitation, Beatrice responded, her hands coming up to rest lightly on his chest as she returned the kiss with a tenderness that surprised even herself. It was brief, this first kiss, but when Owen drew back, Beatrice felt as if something fundamental had shifted within her, as if a door long sealed had finally been opened, letting in light and air and possibility. "Good night, Beatrice," Owen said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good night, Owen," she replied, her own voice hardly more than a whisper. She watched as he climbed back into his wagon and drove away, lifting her hand in farewell as he glanced back. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded did she enter her house, closing the door behind her. In the quiet of her home, surrounded by the wildflowers Owen had brought her over the weeks, some dried now, but still beautiful, Beatrice touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. For the first time in 10 years, she went to bed not with resignation but with anticipation, looking forward to tomorrow, to the flowers that would appear on her doorstep, to Owen's smile, to the new chapter that seemed to be opening before her. As autumn deepened, Owen's courtship of Beatrice became the talk of Silverhorn. He called on her regularly, not just in the early mornings but on Sunday afternoons and occasional evenings. They were seen walking together along the main street, having dinner at the hotel restaurant, attending church side by side. The wildflowers continued to appear on Beatrice's doorstep each morning, though as the season progressed and blooms became scarcer. Owen showed remarkable resourcefulness, bringing late-blooming asters, colorful autumn leaves arranged like bouquets, even dried grasses and berries that he arranged with artistic care. Beatrice found herself changing in ways both subtle and profound. She put away her black dresses, replacing them with garments in deep blues, rich burgundies, forest greens, colors that brought life to her complexion and light to her eyes. She began to bake again, sending Owen to work with packets of cookies or slices of pie that made him the envy of the other ranch hands. Most significantly, she started to engage with the town again. She joined the Ladies' Aid Society, helping to organize assistance for families in need. She volunteered at the small schoolhouse, reading to the younger children once a week. She even attended social gatherings without Owen, occasionally taking tea with Mrs. Peterson or helping Mrs. Harmon organize a quilting circle. "You've brought her back to life, Doctor," Wallace commented to Owen one day as they happened to meet outside the post office. "I haven't seen Beatrice Morrow so vibrant since before Thomas died." Owen tipped his hat respectfully to the older man. "If anything, Doctor, she's brought me back to life as well." It was true. Owen had been drifting before he came to Silverhorn, taking jobs but never putting down roots, doing his work well but never investing himself in the communities he passed through. Now, he found himself becoming part of the fabric of the town, joining the volunteer fire brigade, helping to rebuild the church steeple after a storm damaged it, even considering Mr. Tucker's offer of a permanent position as foreman, once the current man retired in the spring. As winter approached, Owen faced a decision. The bunkhouse at the Rocking T was adequate for summer and fall, but the Montana winters were notoriously harsh. Most of the seasonal hands would move on, seeking work in milder climates until spring. Mr. Tucker kept only a skeleton crew through the coldest months, those with nowhere else to go or with strong ties to the area. "Will you stay?" Beatrice asked one evening in late November as they sat before the fire in her parlor, a chess board between them, a game Owen had been teaching her over the past weeks. Owen moved his knight, capturing one of her pawns before answering. "Mr. Tucker has asked me to. Says he could use a man with my experience through the winter." He looked up, meeting her eyes across the board. "But that's not the only reason I'd stay." Beatrice felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. "No, no," Owen confirmed, his gaze steady on hers. "I'd stay because there's nowhere else I want to be, because Silverhorn has become home to me in a way no place has been since I left Texas." He reached across the chessboard, careful not to disturb the pieces, and took her hand. "Because you're here, Beatrice." The simple honesty in his words touched her deeply. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I can't imagine Silverhorn without you now." They had grown closer over the autumn months, their relationship deepening from cautious friendship to something much more profound. They shared confidences, dreams, memories both painful and precious. They laughed together, occasionally argued, and always found their way back to understanding. Physical affection between them had progressed gradually from that first gentle kiss on the night of the harvest festival to increasingly passionate embraces. Yet Owen had never presumed, never pushed beyond what Beatrice was comfortable with, always respecting the boundaries of propriety even as those boundaries stretched and shifted. Now, looking at him across the chessboard, his face warm in the firelight, Beatrice felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. "Owen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I love you." It was the first time either of them had spoken those words, though they had been hovering unspoken between them for weeks. Owen's eyes widened, then softened with such tenderness that Beatrice felt tears prick at her own. "Beatrice," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I love you too. More than I ever thought I could love again." He rose from his chair, moving around the small table to kneel beside her, still holding her hand in his. "I had planned to wait until Christmas, to do this properly with a ring and all, but," he broke off, then took a deep breath. "Beatrice Morrow, would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" Beatrice felt her heart soar, even as a flicker of fear passed through her. To marry again, to bind herself to another man, to risk that same devastating loss, it was terrifying. And yet, the thought of life without Owen, of returning to that gray existence she'd known for so long, was more frightening still. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now, certainty replacing fear. "Yes, Owen, I will marry you." Joy blazed across his face, and he rose slightly to gather her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at once, overcome by the magnitude of the step they had just taken together. "I don't have a ring yet," Owen apologized, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I don't need a ring," Beatrice assured him. "Just you." That night, after Owen had reluctantly departed with many more kisses and promises to return the next day, Beatrice sat alone by the dying fire, contemplating the remarkable turn her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been the widow in black, isolated in her grief, existing rather than living. Now, she was a bride-to-be, her heart full of love and hope for the future. She thought of Thomas not with the sharp pain that had been her companion for so long, but with a gentle sadness tinged with gratitude for the years they had shared. "I think you would approve, Thomas," she whispered to the quiet room. "I think you would like him." The first heavy snow fell 2 days later, blanketing the landscape in pristine white. Owen, concerned about Beatrice being alone in her homestead during the harsh weather, had wanted to announce their engagement immediately and marry before Christmas. But Beatrice, though certain of her decision, had asked for a bit more time. "Let's wait until spring," she suggested. "We can marry when the wildflowers bloom again, come full circle from when you first started leaving them at my door." Owen had agreed, though he extracted a promise that she would send word immediately if she needed help during the winter months. He made sure her woodpile was stacked high, her pantry well stocked, and her barn secure for her 2 horses and small herd of goats. Despite the weather, they saw each other as often as possible. Sometimes Owen would ride over after his day's work at the ranch, staying for dinner and conversation before reluctantly heading back through the snow. Other times, Beatrice would drive her sleigh into town for supplies and meet Owen for lunch at the hotel. On Christmas Eve, a blizzard swept through the region, making travel impossible. Beatrice, who had planned to attend the Christmas service in town and then have dinner with Owen at the hotel, found herself snowed in, the drifts too deep for either horse or sleigh to navigate safely. She tried not to feel disappointed as she prepared a simple meal for herself, decorated her small home with pine boughs and candles, and read from her Bible by the fire. Christmas had been a difficult time for her since Thomas's death, a holiday meant for family highlighting her solitude. This year, she had been looking forward to celebrating with Owen, to creating new traditions together. As darkness fell and the storm howled around her small house, Beatrice resigned herself to spending Christmas alone. She was just about to retire for the night when she heard an unexpected sound, not the wind, but a rhythmic thumping at her door. Cautiously, she approached, calling out, "Who's there?" "It's me," came Owen's voice, muffled by the storm. "Can you open up? It's colder than a well-digger's feet out here." Beatrice flung the door open to find Owen on her porch, covered in snow, his face red from cold but grinning broadly. In his arms he carried a large sack and, impossibly, a small bunch of pine branches adorned with red berries. "Owen Abernathy," she exclaimed, pulling him inside and closing the door against the swirling snow. "What on earth are you doing out in this storm? You could have frozen to death." "Couldn't miss Christmas with my bride-to-be," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Besides, I couldn't break our tradition." He handed her the pine branches with a flourish. "Not quite wildflowers, but they'll have to do until spring." Beatrice took the makeshift bouquet, torn between exasperation at his recklessness and profound joy at his presence. "You're completely mad," she said, even as she helped him remove his snow-crusted coat and hat. "Madly in love," he corrected, pulling her into his arms once he was free of his outer garments. His embrace was cold from the winter air, but his kiss was warm enough to chase away any chill. When they separated, Beatrice noticed the sack he had brought. "What's all this?" Owen's eyes twinkled with boyish excitement. "Christmas presents from me, and also from the Tuckers and the Harmons and Dr. Wallace and half the town, I think. Everyone was worried about you being alone for Christmas, so when I said I was going to try to make it out here, they loaded me up with gifts and food and well wishes." Touched beyond words, Beatrice helped him unpack the sack. There were jars of preserves and freshly baked bread from Mrs. Tucker, warm woolen mittens knitted by Mrs. Harmon, a beautiful leather-bound journal from Dr. Wallace, and various small gifts from other townspeople. From Owen himself, there was a small box containing a delicate silver locket. "Open it," he urged as she held it in her palm. Inside, she found a tiny photograph of Owen on one side. The other side was empty. "For a picture of us together," he explained. "Once we're married, so you'll always have me close to your heart." Tears filled Beatrice's eyes as she fastened the locket around her neck. "It's perfect," she whispered, "but I don't have anything for you. I was going to give you your gift tomorrow in town." "You've already given me the only thing I want," Owen said, taking her hands in his. "A future, a home, a reason to plant roots instead of drifting. That's worth more than any material gift." They spent Christmas Day together, snowbound but content in each other's company. They prepared a feast from the supplies Owen had brought, sang carols by the fire, and talked for hours about their plans for the future, the wedding in the spring, whether they would live at her homestead or find a place closer to the rocking tea, their hopes for children, for building a life together. As evening fell once more, Beatrice hesitated, then made a decision. "Stay," she said simply. "The storm hasn't let up. It's not safe for you to try to make it back to the ranch tonight." Owen studied her face carefully. "Are you sure? I could sleep on the floor by the fire." Beatrice shook her head. "We're to be married in a few months, and it's Christmas, and I don't want to be apart from you tonight." Understanding dawned in Owen's eyes, followed by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling beside them. "Beatrice," he said, his voice low and reverent, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" In answer, she rose from her chair, took his hand and led him toward her bedroom. At the threshold, she turned to face him, suddenly shy despite her determination. "I love you, Owen. I want to be your wife in every way." Owen cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "And I want to be your husband in every way, but only if you're absolutely certain." "I am," Beatrice whispered, and as she spoke the words, she knew they were true. This wasn't a betrayal of her past, but an embracing of her future, a choice to live fully again, to love without reservation. Owen kissed her then. A kiss that began tenderly but quickly deepened into something more urgent, more passionate. Beatrice responded in kind, allowing herself to feel desire without guilt, to seek pleasure without shame. In the quiet sanctuary of her bedroom, they discovered each other slowly, reverently. Owen's hands and lips were gentle yet assured, coaxing responses from Beatrice's body that she had nearly forgotten were possible. For her part, Beatrice found a boldness she hadn't known she possessed, exploring Owen's strong form with growing confidence. When they finally came together, it was with such profound tenderness that tears sprang to Beatrice's eyes, not from pain or regret, but from the overwhelming rightness of their union. In Owen's arms, she found not just physical satisfaction, but a sense of homecoming, of belonging, of being truly seen and cherished. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, the storm still raging outside but powerless to touch them in their cocoon of warmth, Owen kissed her forehead softly. "Merry Christmas, my love." "Merry Christmas," Beatrice replied, nestling closer against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "The merriest I've had in a very long time." The winter passed in a blur of snow and firelight, of shared meals and long conversations, of deepening love and growing intimacy. Owen spent as many nights at Beatrice's homestead as his duties at the ranch would allow, his presence transforming the once lonely house into a true home filled with laughter and warmth. When spring finally began to melt the snow and coax the first green shoots from the earth, wedding plans that had been theoretical through the winter months suddenly became urgently real. The entire town seemed invested in the upcoming nuptials, offering the church for the ceremony, volunteering to prepare food for the reception, helping Beatrice create a wedding dress from beautiful cream-colored silk, ordered all the way from Denver. "You'd think they were all getting married," Owen laughed one evening as they sorted through another batch of well-meaning suggestions from townspeople. "They're happy for us," Beatrice said, smiling as she read Mrs. Peterson's detailed recommendations for wedding cake flavors. "And I think they're a little proud of themselves for matchmaking, even though they had nothing to do with it." "Nothing?" Owen raised an eyebrow teasingly. "Are you forgetting how Mrs. Harmon practically pushed you into buying that blue dress for the Harvest Festival? Or how Mr. Tucker suddenly decided I needed to take the North Pasture route every morning, which just happened to pass by your homestead?" Beatrice laughed, conceding the point. "All right, perhaps they helped a little. But the important parts, the flowers, the coffee, falling in love, those were all our doing." "Indeed they were," Owen agreed, pulling her into his arms, "and I wouldn't change a moment of it." As April turned to May, the prairie began to bloom with the very wildflowers that had started their courtship. True to their plan, Beatrice and Owen set their wedding date for mid-May, when the landscape would be at its most vibrant. The day before the wedding, Beatrice found herself overwhelmed with last-minute preparations and a surprising case of nerves. She was standing in her kitchen, staring blankly at a list of tasks, when a knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Opening it, she found Mrs. Harmon on her porch, arms laden with packages. "I thought you might need some help, dear," the older woman said, breezing past Beatrice into the house. "And perhaps a friendly ear." Beatrice felt tears of gratitude spring to her eyes. "You have no idea how welcome you are right now." As they worked together, preparing for the next day's festivities, Mrs. Harmon shared stories of her own wedding day nerves nearly 30 years earlier. "I was so certain something would go wrong," she confided as they arranged flowers for the tables. "That William would change his mind, or the cake would collapse, or I'd trip walking down the aisle." "And did any of those things happen?" Beatrice asked, finding comfort in the older woman's calm presence. "Not a one," Mrs. Harmon replied with a chuckle. "Though Reverend Smith did sneeze so violently during the vows that his glasses flew off and landed in the lap of William's grandmother. We all had a good laugh, and it broke the tension beautifully." By the time Mrs. Harmon left, promising to return early the next morning to help Beatrice dress, the younger woman felt considerably calmer. She spent her last evening as a single woman putting final touches on her home, which would host the wedding reception after the church ceremony. As she worked, Beatrice found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The decade of grief that had seemed endless, the morning Owen had first left flowers on her doorstep, the gradual awakening of her heart, the joy she had discovered in loving and being loved again. She thought of Thomas, too, allowing herself to remember him with clear-eyed affection rather than consuming grief. "I hope you can see me now," she whispered to the quiet room. "I hope you know I'll always carry you with me, even as I move forward." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the May sunshine warm but not hot, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers across the prairie. Mrs. Harmon arrived as promised, along with Mrs. Peterson and young Jenny Wallace, the doctor's daughter, all eager to help the bride prepare. "Something old," Mrs. Peterson said, presenting Beatrice with a delicate lace handkerchief that had belonged to her grandmother. "Something new," Mrs. Harmon added, bringing forth a pair of satin shoes that matched Beatrice's dress perfectly. "Something borrowed," Jenny offered shyly, holding out a pearl hairpin that her mother had worn at her own wedding. "And something blue," Mrs. Harmon finished, fastening a small sapphire brooch to the inside of Beatrice's dress, right over her heart, for happiness and fidelity. Dressed in her cream silk gown, her dark hair arranged in an elegant knot adorned with tiny white flowers, Beatrice hardly recognized herself in the mirror. Gone was the austere widow in black. In her place stood a radiant bride, her eyes bright with joy and anticipation. Dr. Wallace, who had offered to escort her to the church in lieu of a father, arrived precisely on time, his eyes widening at the sight of her. "My dear," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are absolutely beautiful. Owen is a fortunate man indeed." "Thank you, Doctor," Beatrice replied, squeezing his hand gratefully, "for everything." The small church was filled to capacity, the entire town having turned out for the occasion. As Beatrice stood at the back, arm linked with Dr. Wallace's, the music began. Mrs. Tucker at the piano, playing the traditional wedding march. Beatrice took a deep breath and began the walk down the aisle. She was aware of the smiling faces turned toward her, of the flowers decorating every pew, of the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. But most of all, she was aware of Owen standing at the altar, his eyes fixed on her with such love and wonder that her heart seemed to expand in her chest. He was handsome in his new suit, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. But it was the expression he wore that truly took Beatrice's breath away, a mixture of awe, joy, and absolute certainty that made her own steps more confident, her own smile more radiant. When she reached him, Owen took her hands in his touch steadying her as they turned to face Reverend Smith. The ceremony itself passed in something of a blur, the familiar words of the marriage service, the promises spoken in clear, unwavering voices, the exchange of simple gold bands that Owen had purchased on a special trip to Helena. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Smith declared, beaming at them both. "You may kiss the bride." Owen lifted Beatrice's veil with reverent hands, his eyes meeting hers with such tenderness that she felt tears of happiness well up. "Hello, Mrs. Abernathy," he whispered, just for her ears. "Hello, husband," she replied, and then his lips were on hers, sealing their vows with a kiss that was both gentle and passionate, a promise of all they would share in the years to come. The reception at Beatrice's, now their home, was a joyous affair, spilling from the house onto the surrounding land. Tables had been set up beneath trees adorned with ribbons and lanterns, loaded with food contributed by nearly everyone in town. Music, laughter, and conversation filled the air as friends and neighbors celebrated the union of two people who had found their way back to happiness after profound loss. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festivities, Owen led Beatrice away from the crowd to a quiet spot beneath the old oak tree at the edge of her property. From his pocket, he produced a small bouquet of wildflowers, lupines, and paintbrush, the very same flowers he had first left on her doorstep nearly a year ago. "For you, Mrs. Abernathy," he said, presenting them with a formal bow that made her laugh. "The first of many I'll bring you in the years to come." Beatrice took the flowers, bringing them to her face to inhale their sweet scent. "I'll hold you to that promise," she said, her eyes shining with love. "Every morning," Owen vowed, drawing her into his arms. "For as long as wildflowers bloom and beyond." As he kissed her beneath the oak tree, with the sounds of celebration drifting on the evening breeze and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that she had found her second chance at happiness, not a replacement for what she had lost, but a new beginning, different but equally precious. The widow who had sat alone in black for 10 years had found her way back to light and life and love, all because a cowboy had laid wildflowers at her door every morning, awakening her heart with simple, steadfast devotion. 10 years later, on a bright May morning much like their wedding day, Beatrice stood on the porch of the comfortable ranch house she and Owen had built halfway between her original homestead and the rocking T, where Owen now served as head foreman. She watched as her husband approached on horseback, returning from his early morning ride, their 8-year-old son Thomas riding proudly beside him on his own pony, their 6-year-old daughter Sarah behind in the saddle with her father. As they dismounted, Owen reached into his saddlebag and produced a bouquet of wildflowers, lupines, paintbrush, daisies, and columbine, which he presented to Beatrice with the same smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. "For you, my love," he said, leaning down to kiss her as their children giggled and made exaggerated sounds of disgust. As promised, every morning, Beatrice took the flowers, adding them to the vase on the porch table that was never empty, no matter the season. "And I'm grateful for every single one," she replied, her eyes meeting his with a love that had only deepened with the passing years. As they all went inside for breakfast, Beatrice thought of how full her life had become with love, with children, with purpose and joy. The grief that had once defined her was now just a part of her story, not its entirety. She had learned that hearts, like the prairie after a harsh winter, could bloom again given time and tender care. And it had all begun with wildflowers left at her door by a cowboy who had seen beyond her mourning to the woman waiting to be rediscovered, who had brought color back into a world that had faded to black and white, one blossom at a time.